"I'm your mother," said the woman everyone thought had died in the Wagon Train Massacre 20 years ago. 20 years ago, everyone in Millers Creek thought Sarah Morrison died in the Wagon Train Massacre. Her son Jack buried what he thought were her remains and became the deadliest bounty hunter in the West. But when he walks into that dusty saloon and a woman with familiar green eyes whispers, "I'm your mother," everything he thought he knew about life, death, and family is about to shatter like glass on a barroom floor. The dust rose like prayers from beneath his horse's hooves as Jack Morrison rode into Millers Creek. The town sat dying in the afternoon heat, its wooden buildings bleached white as old bones. 20 years of hunting men had carved lines deep into his face, and his eyes held the color of winter sky, cold and distant. His horse moved slow through the empty street. A dog slept in the shade of the general store. An old man sat whittling on a porch, not bothering to look up. The wind pushed tumbleweeds past boarded windows and broken dreams. This was the kind of place men came to disappear, and Jack had learned to find ghosts in places like this. The saloon door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, 3 men played cards at a corner table, their voices low and tired. The bartender was fat and sweaty, wiping glasses that would never be clean. Jack took a seat at the bar and set his hat on the stool beside him. The leather of his gun belt creaked like old saddles. "Whiskey," he said. The bartender poured without looking up. Jack reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a photograph, worn soft at the edges from 20 years of handling. The faces in the picture were faded, but he could still see them. His mother's smile, his father's strong hands, his own young face staring back with eyes that still held hope. He took a sip of whiskey and felt it burn down his throat like regret. "You look like you're carrying something heavy." The voice came from behind him, soft as evening wind. Jack turned and saw her, a woman maybe 45 years old, with gray streaking her brown hair. She wore a simple dress, mended in places, and an apron tied around her waist. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were the same green as spring grass, the same green he saw in mirrors, the same green he remembered from 20 years ago. She set down the tray she was carrying and moved closer. The saloon had gone quiet. Even the card players had stopped their game. Jack's hand moved toward his gun without thinking, the way a man's body remembers danger before his mind catches up. "Easy," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him pause. "I'm not here to hurt you." She looked at the photograph in his hands. Her face went white as winter morning. Jack watched her lips part, watched her hand reach up to touch her throat. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. "That picture," she whispered. "Where did you get it?" Jack's voice came out rough as sandpaper. "It's mine. Been mine for 20 years. She stepped closer, and he could see the scars on her hands, thin white lines across her knuckles. There were more scars on her neck, disappearing under the collar of her dress. She looked like a woman who had fought hard to stay alive. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jack Morrison." The words hit her like a physical blow. She grabbed the edge of the bar to steady herself, and Jack saw her eyes fill with tears. 20 years of bounty hunting had taught him to read faces, to see truth in the way people breathed. But this woman knew him. This woman knew that name. "Jack," she said, and the way she said it made his chest tight. "My God, my boy." The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the floor and shattered, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. Whiskey spread across the boards like spilled blood. Jack stared at the broken glass, then looked up at her face. "Ma'am, I think you got me confused with someone else." But even as he said the words, he knew they were lies. He could see it now, the shape of her nose, the way she held her head, the small mole just beside her left ear. Features he remembered from childhood, from before the wagon train, from before everything went to hell. "Your mother died 20 years ago," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She died when the Comanche hit the wagon train. I saw the bodies. I buried what was left." The woman, his mother, reached out with trembling fingers and touched his cheek. Her skin was rough from years of hard work, but her touch was gentle as rain. "I didn't die, Jack, though there were times I wished I had." The room spun around him like a dust devil. Jack gripped the bar with both hands, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, what he was hearing. The card players were staring now, their game forgotten. The fat bartender had stopped pretending to clean glasses. "This ain't possible," Jack said. "You're dead. You've been dead for 20 years. "I know what it looks like," she said. "I know what you must have thought. But I'm here now. I'm standing right in front of you." Jack looked down at his hands. They were shaking. The hands that had killed 37 men were shaking like child's. He thought about all the years he'd spent alone, all the nights he'd fallen asleep to the memory of flames and screaming. He thought about the grave he'd visited every year on the anniversary, the headstone that read, "Sarah Morrison, beloved wife and mother." Ow! The word came out broken. She looked around the saloon, at the watching faces, at the broken glass on the floor. "Not here. There's too much to say, and these walls have too many ears." Jack nodded slowly. He picked up his hat and put it on, his movements careful and deliberate. Everything felt fragile, like one wrong move would shatter whatever miracle had brought them together. "Where?" he asked. "I have a cabin. Half a mile north of town by the creek." She untied her apron and hung it on a hook behind the bar. "I'll walk with you." They moved toward the door together, and Jack felt like he was walking through a dream. The afternoon sun hit his face, but he couldn't feel its warmth. His mother, if this woman truly was his mother, walked beside him, her footsteps quiet in the dust. As they reached his horse, she looked up at him with those familiar green eyes. "I know you have questions. I know this don't make sense. But Jack," she paused, searching for words, "I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a single day in 20 years. Jack untied his horse's reins, his hands still trembling. The weight of 20 years pressed down on him like stones. All those nights, he'd wondered if she'd suffered, if she'd thought about him before the end. All those years, he'd carried guilt like a scar across his heart. Now she stood beside him, alive and breathing, and he didn't know whether to embrace her or run. The boy in him wanted to cry. The man he'd become wanted answers. But deeper than both, in a place he'd kept locked away for 2 decades, something that had been broken was starting to hope it might be whole again. The cabin sat by the creek like a secret whispered to the wind. It was small and weathered, built from logs that had seen too many seasons. Smoke drifted up from the chimney, and wildflowers grew wild around the doorstep. Jack tied his horse to a fence post and followed his mother, the woman who claimed to be his mother, up the narrow path. Inside, the cabin was clean but sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner with a quilt that looked hand-sewn. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a collection of small stones, each one smooth and round. Jack wondered if she had gathered them from the creek, if touching them brought her some kind of peace. She moved to the stove and put coffee on to boil. Her movements were careful, practiced. Jack watched her hands as she worked, the same hands that used to braid his hair, that used to check his forehead for fever. But these hands are different now. Scarred. The knuckles were thick, and there was a white line across her palm that hadn't been there before. "Sit," she said softly. Jack remained standing. 20 years of staying alive had taught him not to sit with his back to a door. He kept his hand near his gun, not because he feared her, but because nothing in his world had prepared him for this moment. "You want to know how I lived?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I buried pieces of you," Jack said. His voice was rough as creek gravel. "I found your dress, torn and bloody. I found Pa's watch, melted from the fire. I stood over graves and said words over empty boxes. Sarah," he still couldn't think of her as anything but a ghost, poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The smell filled the cabin, rich and dark. She set 1 cup on the table and held the other between her hands like it might warm something deeper than her fingers. "I was hurt bad," she said. "Arrow went through my shoulder, another through my leg. I fell between 2 burning wagons and couldn't get up. The smoke was thick as mud, and I could barely breathe." She sat down at the table, her eyes fixed on something far away. Jack saw her lips tremble before she pressed them together, sealing the words inside until she was ready to let them out. "I could hear them," she continued. "The warriors. They were checking the bodies, making sure everyone was dead. I heard them talking, and I knew if they found me breathing, it would be over. She took a sip of coffee, her hands steady despite the weight of memory. So I held my breath, played dead while the wagons burned around me. Jack's chest felt tight. He had imagined her death 1,000 different ways, but never this. Never her lying in the dirt, pretending to be gone while fire ate everything she'd ever known. The smoke saved me, she said, made it hard for them to see clear. When they moved on, I crawled under the wagon bed and waited. Waited until the sun went down and the fire burned itself out. Then I crawled to the creek. How long? Jack asked. 3 days. I drank creek water and ate wild berries. My wounds were going bad, and I knew I was dying. She looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made him want to look away. Part of me wanted to die. Everyone I loved was gone. My husband. My boy. Her voice broke on the last word. I thought you were dead, Jack. I saw you running toward the trees when the shooting started, and then nothing. Jack remembered that day like a scar across his mind. He'd been 12 years old, helping his father load supplies when the war cries split the morning air. His father had shoved him toward the tree line, shouting at him to run. Jack had run, but not far enough. He'd hidden in the brush and watched the slaughter, watched the flames consume everything he'd ever called home. I ran, he said. I hid like a coward while they killed everyone. You were a child, Sarah said firmly. You did what your father told you to do. You lived. The word hung between them like smoke. Lived. Such a simple word for something so complicated. On the 4th day, she continued, they found me. 3 Comanche warriors, coming back to check the burned wagons for anything they'd missed. I was half dead by then, but still breathing. She touched the scar on her neck, a thin white line just below her ear. They took me with them. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard stories about what happened to captives. Most of those stories ended badly. 20 years, he said. 20 years. She nodded slowly. I lived with the band that took me. Learned their language, their ways. Learned to survive. She stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. The first few years were the hardest. I kept hoping someone would come for me. Kept thinking about you, wondering if you'd made it out alive. I looked for you, Jack said. The words came out harsh, angry. I spent 2 years searching. Asked every trader, every soldier, every scout. No one had seen a white woman matching your description. They moved me north, deep into their territory. By the time anyone might have seen me, I looked different, dressed different, spoke different. She turned back to him, and he saw tears on her cheeks. I became someone else, Jack. Had to stay alive. The cabin felt too small suddenly. Jack walked to the window and looked out at the creek. Water moved over stones, endless and patient. He thought about all the years he'd spent hunting bounties, all the men he'd killed. He'd become someone else too, but for different reasons. How did you get away? He asked. The man who kept me. He died last winter. Fever took him quick. She joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the soap she used, something clean and simple. His sons didn't want a white woman around anymore. They brought me to a trading post near the border, sold me to a merchant heading south. Sold you. Like a horse. Like a gun. Her voice was calm, but Jack heard the steel underneath. The merchant was kind enough. Brought me here to Miller's Creek, gave me work in the saloon. Said I could stay as long as I needed. They stood in silence, watching the water flow. Jack tried to imagine 20 years of captivity, 20 years of being someone else. He tried to imagine the strength it must have taken to survive, to keep hoping. Did you? He started the question, then stopped. Some things were too heavy for words. Did I have children with them? She finished. No. There's a reason for that, but it's not something we need to talk about today. Jack nodded. He understood there were some stories that needed time to tell, some wounds that needed careful handling. She touched his arm, her fingers light as bird wings. I need you to know something, Jack. Not a day passed that I didn't think about you. Not a single day in 20 years. I used to lie awake at night and wonder what kind of man you'd become. Wonder if you'd learned to shave, if you'd found a wife, if you had children of your own. Jack looked down at her hand on his arm. Such a small thing, that touch, but it carried the weight of 2 decades. He thought about all the nights he'd fallen asleep to memories of her voice. All the mornings he'd woken up wishing he could hear her laugh just one more time. "I became a killer," he said quietly. "That's what kind of man I became." Sarah's grip tightened on his arm. "You became a survivor, just like me." She looked up into his face, searching for something. "The question now is what we do with the time we have left. How we learn to be a family again, if that's even possible." The word family hit him like a physical blow, and Jack realized he'd forgotten how to hope for things like that. The anger came like summer lightning, sudden and fierce. Jack turned away from the window and walked to the far side of the cabin, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal. 20 years, he said, his voice tight with rage. 20 goddamn years. Sarah watched him from across the room, her face calm, but her eyes alert. She'd seen angry men before. She knew the signs, knew when to speak and when to stay silent. "You were alive," Jack continued, pacing now like a wolf in a trap. "All this time, you were breathing and eating and sleeping, and I was—" He stopped, his throat working. "I was alone. I was 12 years old and alone in the world." "Jack, no." The word came out sharp as a whip crack. "You don't get to say my name like that. Not after 20 years. He turned to face her, and she could see the boy he'd been hiding behind the man's hard features. "Do you know what I did? Do you know what I became?" Sarah said nothing. She folded her hands at her lap and waited. "I killed my first man when I was 14, Jack said. His voice was steady now, cold as winter water. "Some drifter tried to rob me outside Tucson. I put a bullet through his heart and watched him die in the dirt. Felt nothing. Nothing at all." He walked to the mantel and picked up one of her smooth stones, turning it over in his palm. "After that, it got easier. Man in El Paso who drew on me in a card game. 3 brothers in Santa Fe who tried to bushwhack me for the bounty on my head. A preacher in Dodge City who wasn't much of a preacher at all. The stone was warm from the fire's heat." Jack set it back down, his movements careful and deliberate. 37 men, he said. "That's how many I've killed. 37 souls on my conscience because I had to learn to survive without a mother, without a father, without anyone who gave a damn whether I lived or died." Sarah's voice was soft as evening wind. "I gave a damn. You were gone." The words exploded out of him like gunpowder. "You were dead. I stood over your grave every year and told you about my life, about the men I'd killed, about how empty everything felt without you. I talked to dirt and stones and bones that weren't even yours." Jack's chest heaved like he'd been running. 20 years of buried grief was clawing its way to the surface, and he couldn't stop it. He thought about all the nights he'd fallen asleep to her memory, all the mornings he'd woken up reaching for something that wasn't there. "I look for you," he said, his voice breaking. "God help me, I looked everywhere. Asked every Indian agent, every trader, every scout who'd take my money. Followed every rumor, every whispered story about white captives. I rode into Comanche country alone more times than I can count, hoping I'd find some trace of you. You could have been killed. I didn't care." The admission came out raw and honest. "Part of me wanted to die. Would have been easier than carrying the weight of losing everyone I ever loved." Sarah stood slowly and walked to a small wooden box on the shelf beside the fireplace. Her movements were careful, reverent. She opened the box and reached inside, pulling out something small that caught the firelight. "I need to show you something," she said. Jack looked at what she held in her palm, a small silver locket, tarnished with age but still recognizable. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that locket, had seen it around her neck every day of his childhood. "I thought they took it," he whispered. "They tried." Sarah opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, faded but still clear. One showed a young man with kind eyes and strong hands, Jack's father. The other showed a boy with a gap-toothed grin and wild hair, Jack at 7 years old. "I hid it," she said. "Kept it hidden for 20 years. They never found it. No matter how many times they searched me, no matter how many times they took everything else away. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. This is how I remembered you. This is how I kept you alive in my heart. Jack stared at the tiny photograph of himself as a child. He remembered the day it was taken, remembered how his mother had fussed over his hair, how his father had made him laugh just before the photographer snapped the picture. He'd been so young then, so innocent. Before the world had taught him that love was just another thing that could be taken away. I used to take it out at night, Sarah continued. When no one was watching, I'd hold it and remember your laugh. Remember how you used to bring me wildflowers from the meadow behind our house. Remember the way you'd curl up against me during thunderstorms. Something inside Jack's chest cracked like ice in spring. He reached out with one shaking hand and touched the locket, felt the worn silver beneath his fingertips. You picked purple ones, Sarah said softly. Always purple. So they match my dress. Jack closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 7 years old again, running through tall grass with flowers clutched in his fist. He could smell his mother's soap, feel her arms around him, hear her voice singing lullabies in the dark. I forgot, he whispered. I made myself forget because it hurt too much to remember. I never forgot. Not once in 20 years. Sarah closed the locket but kept it in her palm. When things got bad, and they got very bad sometimes, I'd think about that little boy bringing me flowers. I'd think about how proud you'd be when you grew up, how strong and brave and good. Jack opened his eyes and looked at her. I'm not good. I haven't been good for a long time. You're here, she said simply. You're standing in my cabin, alive and breathing. You survived. That's good enough for now. The anger was still there, burning in his chest like coals, but it felt different now. Mixed with something else, grief, maybe, or love that had been buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Jack thought about all the years he'd spent running from his past, all the ways he'd tried to forget the boy he used to be. I don't know how to do this, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. I don't know how to be your son anymore. Sarah smiled, and for a moment, Jack could see the woman she'd been before the world broke her. We'll figure it out, she said. We have time now. All the time we need. Jack looked down at his hands. The same hands that had killed 37 men. The same hands that had once picked wildflowers for his mother. He thought about the weight he'd been carrying all these years, the anger and grief and loneliness that had shaped him into someone he barely recognized. I'm scared, he admitted. So am I, Sarah said. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared just means we have something worth fighting for again. She held out the locket to him. This belongs to you as much as it does to me. Your father's face, your child's smile. Our family, such as we are. Jack took the locket, felt its familiar weight in his palm. It was warm from her touch, warm from 20 years of being held close to her heart. He looked at the photographs again, his father's strength, his own innocence, and wondered if it was possible for broken things to be made whole again. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the cabin walls gold. Soon it would be dark, and they would have to decide what came next. But for now, Jack stood holding a piece of his past, trying to remember what it felt like to be loved. Night came gentle to the cabin by the creek. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Jack sat in one of the wooden chairs, turning the silver locket over and over in his hands. The metal was warm now, warmed by his touch, and he could feel the weight of the photographs inside. His father's face, his own young smile. Sarah moved quietly around the small space, banking the coals, setting out blankets. She moved like a woman who had learned to be comfortable with silence, who understood that some conversations happened without words. You can stay, she said softly. Tonight, I mean, if you want. Jack looked up from the locket. The offer hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. He thought about his horse tied outside, about the bedroll behind his saddle, about all the nights he'd slept under stars with nothing but the wind for company. I don't remember the last time I slept indoors, he said. Then it's time you did. She poured water from a pitcher into a basin and set it on the table beside him. The simple gesture, a mother preparing to wash her grown son's face, made something tight in his chest loosen. He hadn't realized how tired he was, how bone-deep weary from carrying 20 years of anger and grief. Jack stood and unbuckled his gun belt. The leather was worn smooth from years of wearing, and the weight of the Colt had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. He looked at the gun for a long moment, the tool that had kept him alive, that had made him into the man he'd become. Then he hung it on the back of the chair. Sarah watched him do it, understanding what it meant. A man didn't remove his gun unless he felt safe. A man like Jack Morrison didn't feel safe anywhere. "Your father used to do that," she said quietly, every night when he came in from the fields. First thing he'd do was hang up that old Remington of his, roll up his sleeves, and wash the dust from his hands. Jack dipped his hands in the basin, felt the cool water run between his fingers. The dust of 20 years seemed to wash away with it. Dust from 1,000 trails, from 100 towns, from graves that weren't graves and memories that had turned to ghosts. "Tell me about him," Jack said. "About Pa. I remember pieces, but you were young when he died." Sarah sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Thomas Morrison was the gentlest man I ever knew. Strong as an ox when he needed to be, but gentle. He'd sit for hours just watching you play in the dirt, making little towns out of sticks and stones." Jack dried his hands on a towel, remembering suddenly the feel of calloused fingers ruffling his hair, the sound of deep laughter echoing across their small farm. "He wanted to teach you to read," Sarah continued. "Said a man needed books as much as he needed boots. Used to practice his letters in the evening, tracing them on paper with that stub of pencil he carried. He wasn't much for schooling himself, but he wanted better for you." "I learned," Jack said. "Taught myself from wanted posters and newspaper scraps. Not much of an education, but it kept me alive." He would have been proud. Sarah's voice was soft as evening wind. "Proud that you survived, that you made your own way in the world." Jack wasn't sure about that. He thought about the men he'd killed, the violence that had shaped his life. He wondered what his father would have said about the 37 graves that followed in his wake. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the creek whispered its endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. Jack felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Peace, maybe, or something close to it. "I want to show you something else," Sarah said. She stood and walked to the small trunk beside her bed, opened it with careful hands. From inside, she pulled out a piece of cloth, faded blue with tiny yellow flowers. Jack recognized it immediately. "Your dress. The one from the picture. I made it the year before we left for California. Worked on it in the evenings while you and your father played checkers by the fire." She held the fabric up to the light, and Jack could see the careful stitches, the hours of love sewn into every seam. "Somehow, in all those years, I managed to keep a piece of it, hidden it away like the locket." Jack reached out and touched the cloth. It was soft as silk, worn thin in places but still beautiful, still carrying the memory of better times. "I used to dream about that dress," he said, "about you wearing it, standing in the doorway of our house, calling me in for supper. I dreamed about that too." Sarah folded the cloth carefully and set it aside. "Dreamed about a lot of things that couldn't be. But some dreams find a way to come true, even when we think they're dead and buried." She moved to the stove and began preparing coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. "Your father had a particular way he liked it made. Strong, but not bitter. Said coffee should wake you up gentle, not knock you down." Jack watched her work, memorizing the way she measured the grounds, the way she waited for the water to reach just the right temperature. Simple things, but they felt important now. They felt like family. "He'd sit right there where you're sitting," she said, nodding toward his chair. "Read me pieces from the newspaper, tell me about his plans for the farm. We were going to plant apple trees when we got to California. A whole orchard of them. I remember the apples," Jack said. "You used to make pies. Terrible pies." Sarah laughed, and the sound was like music he'd forgotten he knew. "Crust tough as leather, filling sweet enough to rot your teeth. But your father ate every bite and asked for seconds." The coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups and handed one to Jack. He took a sip and tasted something more than coffee. He tasted memory, tasted home. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower and the night grew deeper. Jack felt years of tension leaving his shoulders, felt the hard armor he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. He thought about all the lonely nights, all the empty dawns, all the times he'd wished for this exact moment. I killed a lot of men, he said suddenly. I know, some of them probably had mothers, probably had families waiting for them to come home. Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked at him across the small table. You did what you had to do to survive. That doesn't make it right, but it doesn't make you evil either. It just makes you human. I don't know how to stop, Jack said. The killing, I mean. It's all I know now. Then learn something new. Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Learn how to live instead of just survive. Learn how to be my son again. Jack looked down at their joined hands, hers scarred from 20 years of hardship, his stained with 20 years of blood. But somehow together they looked right. They looked like they belonged. I don't know if I can, he said. We'll figure it out, Sarah said. One day at a time. One cup of coffee at a time. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky. Soon the sun would rise, and they would have to decide what came next, where they would go, what they would do with the gift of finding each other again. But for now, they sat in the dying firelight, mother and son, sharing 20 years of silence, and learning that some things, love, family, hope, could survive even the longest winter, even the deepest grave. Jack squeezed his mother's hand and felt something that had been broken inside him begin, slowly, to heal.